As you'll know by now, if you've been coming on these Tuesday nights, our theme at the moment is Buddhism through time and space. So Buddhism is an incredibly rich, diverse tradition, actually, which can be very confusing, or it can be very inspiring, and give us all sorts of things that can inspire us and help us in our practice. So we're going to be looking, well, we have been looking at how Buddhism has adapted itself to different cultures, different time periods, as a way of exploring which bits of all that diversity might help us to practice here and now. And since the new year, we've been looking at a movement in Buddhism, a style of Buddhism that called itself the Mahayana, the Great Way, the Great Vehicle, which seems to have been an attempt to re-emphasise aspects of the Dharma that seem to have got lost sight of in the 500 years or so after the Buddha died, especially the sort of heart aspects of the Dharma, the need for warm, positive emotions, the fact that metta and compassion are essential to progress, and that we can't practice the Dharma, after a while anyway, we can't practice the Dharma just to make ourselves happier. We actually have to do it to be of more use, to make the world a better place. We have to get out of just thinking of ourselves, because that's part of what being more enlightened is. And so this new school, if you like, sort of trend, Mahayana, and most of the schools of Buddhism in the world today are Mahayana. The only exception is the Buddhism of Thailand, Sri Lanka and Burma. The Buddhism of China, Japan, Korea, Central Asia, Tibet, comes from the Mahayana. So that's what we're looking at. And tonight's going to be a bit weird, I warned you. Tonight we're going to be looking at two of the great figures of Mahayana Buddhism, who started, if you like, two great trends within that tradition that Western scholars often see as being in conflict. So the first of these figures is the Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna, who lived sometime between 100 and 250 years into the Christian era, and was one of the pioneers of this new form of Buddhism called Mahayana. Nagarjuna was actually getting back to something closer to original Buddhism at a time when the tradition had got a bit bogged down in later accretions. It got a bit tied up in its own categories and its lists and its scholarship, and maybe lost sight of the sort of fresh, radical, liberating nature of what the Buddha taught. So Sangha says, by shattering the hard shell of literalism in which Buddhism was then imprisoned, Nagarjuna not only saved it from suffocation and probable death, but gave it room for future development. So he's sometimes called the second Buddha. And Nagarjuna was the main founding figure of what we could call a philosophical school called the Madhyamaka. So there's Nagarjuna and the Madhyamaka, his school. And then the second figure we're going to look at is Asanga, who lived maybe 150 years after Nagarjuna, and was one of the key figures in establishing what is called the Yogacara school. Yogacara. Some people can't see, obviously. The Yogacara school. Yogacara, Madhyamaka, means middle way. And Yogacara means something like path of practice. And Nagarjuna, so right down through the history of Mahayana Buddhism to the present day, we've got this sort of contrast between Nagarjuna's sharply rational Madhyamaka approach and Asanga's more visionary, imaginal Yogacara approach. And they've sort of existed in a creative tension. And one of the things we're going to explore tonight is how these apparently very different approaches to the Dhamma, or what they are, and how they can both feed into our practice. I should say that Bodhinaga and I are going to do this talk together, okay? And that's going to be very weird. When we sat down to talk about this talk, between us, it became obvious to me that we had set ourselves a quite ridiculous challenge, which was to convey these two mammoth wings of the Dhamma to you in 45 minutes or something. Everything we're going to say today is a simplification, okay? And if there are any scholars watching, hello? If there are any scholars of Buddhist history watching, please forgive us for taking a broad brush approach here, because that's what we're going to be doing. I hope you'll forgive us and forget about the subtleties. So, so we build this talk as anyway, tonight we're going to talk about what these two great wings of the Dharma can offer our practice. And we've called this talk rather mysteriously Teaching from Dogs and Dragons, which may become apparent why we called it that as we go on. And I should say this is a great experiment because we're going to do this talk as a sort of debate between Bodhinaga and myself with extra bits. And this is a huge experiment, and it might be fun, and it might just be terrible. So I ask forgiveness not only from the scholars, hello there, but also from our audience. But now I'd like to introduce you to a very great celebrity from Buddhist history, the very venerable Nagarjuna, who is going to tell us about the teaching he got from the dragons.
I am the great teacher Nagarjuna, the great Nagarjuna with my snake staff. Yes, and I am the founder of the great school, the Madhyamaka School of Philosophy. Yes. But it was a great school. And there's lots of legends surrounding my life, but I can tell you I lived about 150 in the Common Era, about 1800 years ago. And I founded one of the greatest schools of Buddhism, the Madhyamaka School of Buddhism. And I'm a great friend of the Nagas. What are the Nagas, you might ask? Well, Nagas are great serpent-like beings that live in the depths of the ocean, great serpents. And according to Buddhist myths, the Nagas are protectors of wisdom. They protect wisdom from minds that aren't ready for them yet. So I'm a great friend of the Nagas. And because of this, I'm sometimes depicted with snakes around my head. Sometimes coming from behind my head. And occasionally, very occasionally, stitched to a shower cap. So yes, I'm a great friend of the Nagas. It was the Nagas who presented me with my philosophy, my teachings, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. I'm very, very famous for being somebody who propagated and translated the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. For example, the Heart Sutra, the great Heart Sutra that you chant in your pujas, came from my Perfection of Wisdom literature. So I'm very famous, and it was said that in the legends, the Naga princess gave me these teachings because ordinary human minds weren't ready for these teachings. And I was called, as your Sheffield teacher Vedanya said, I was called the second Buddha. I was known as the second Buddha because I re-emphasised the teachings of the first Buddha. At my time, around my time, these Buddhists had got a little bit off track and they started to veer away from the true teachings of the Buddha. So I had to put them straight, and I was called the second Buddha. So, what I want to do is recap some of the teachings of the historical Buddha, some important teachings. Bear with me. No heckling, please. So, a friend of mine called Bodhinaga told me that you have an Introducing Buddhism and Meditation course in Sheffield. I was very pleased to hear this. And I was pleased to hear that you study the 3 lakshanas of the historical Buddha. So what are these 3 lakshanas? Let me recap. The first one is impermanence. All things are impermanent. Everything is in a constant change of flux. Everything from the greatest mountains to the greatest galaxies, everything is constantly changing. Even the minutest things, even like the cells in your body, the mind, even the weather, it's constantly changing. Every cell in your body renews itself after 7 years. So there's a great teaching of impermanence, anicca, from the historical Buddha. The second and the most important teaching, I think, of the three lakshanas is anatman, the teaching of anatman. And the teaching of anatman says that there not only are things always changing, there are no things that change. Because everything is interconnected, everything is interrelated with other things. Things don't exist separately and interdependent from other things. So everything relies on everything else for its existence. And this is the great teaching of anatman. So you, for example, you don't exist independently and separately. You rely on everything around you. So you only exist because of the glint in your father's eye a long time ago. That's one reason why you exist. Why else? All the ideas you have, all the concepts, well, they're borrowed, they're conditioned by the world around you. You think the ideas you do, the opinions you have, they're influenced and conditioned by the culture you live in. If you were brought up in a completely different culture, you would think and act very, very differently to how you do. So we've got this idea that you're separate, you've got this idea that you're an independent, separate being, but actually you're not. There's this idea of anatman says that there is no fixed self. There is no self that is fixed and unchanging. And basically around my time, which was 150 in the Common Era, Buddhists had lost touch with this teaching a little bit. Buddhists had developed lots and lots of lists to help them analyse the self, break down the self into different parts, and to notice that it wasn't permanent. There was nothing there. You could look at all these different parts and you couldn't find a self. There was no self to be found. So there's lots of different lists that Buddhists used to analyse their self and their experience. And it became a school that was very, very fond of lists. In fact, they got a bit too fond of lists and I had to sort them out. They were called the Abhidharma school. I've got it written down somewhere, but we'll forget about that. The Abhidharma school. And they had this list of dharmas. They said everything can be broken down into dharmas. And these dharmas are irreducible. And they've got essential being. They've got a certain quality that doesn't change. They've got an own being, an essential quality, which is a load of nonsense. This was a load of nonsense because the Buddha taught nothing has essential quality. Nothing has its own being or its own nature. There's nothing which is unchanging and not connected with everything else. But these Abhidharmists, they got it all wrong. They started to teach people. Think there's these list of dharmas, and they have their own nature, their own being. So that's just where I had to come in to save the day with my shower cap. And I had to introduce a teaching of Shunyata. Now, Shunyata was me re-emphasising the teaching of anatman, but Shunyata literally could be translated as emptiness. And I had to teach the Abhidharmas that all these lists they had, there's nothing in them which has got its own nature. They're all empty of own being. They're all empty of their own nature. Just bear with me a second. It's a bit distracting having a shower cap with So, for example, nothing has its own being. So take my friend Fred, for example. I've got a friend called Fred, and he doesn't have snakes on his head. He's just a regular person. And Fred sometimes gets angry. Fred will get angry at people. But then what I notice with Fred is it doesn't last. His mood passes, his anger passes. It doesn't last forever. So you couldn't say that his anger is part of Fred because it's not always there. It's only there sometimes. So you couldn't say that Fred's anger is an essential part of him. And I've also noticed with Fred that he's sometimes angry with some friends, but in other situations he's quite nice and quite calm and quite placid. So also Fred's anger seems to be dependent on the situations he's in and the environment that he's in. So his anger, again, can't be said to be part of himself. It's not an integral part of Fred. It's something that's dependent on situations. So what I did, Nagarjuna did all those years ago, was I used logic to prove that anything you could think of doesn't have its own nature. It's always temporary, and it always is interdependent. It's always dependent on the things around it. There's nothing you can think of. Any idea you can think of is empty. It's shunyata, it's emptiness. So that's what I did. I introduced this great idea, this great teaching of shunyata, emptiness. And I was able to disprove all the teachings, all the ideas, all these nonsense ideas people have come up with. I was able to disprove. So going back to the lakshanas, So the third teaching of the Buddha, the third Lakshana was dukkha. And that says that if you act in this way, if you act as if things have their own quality, their own nature, their own essential nature, it's going to cause suffering. Because they're going to last, they're not going to last, they're going to break, they're going to fail, they're going to be unreliable. Like Fred, they're going to be unreliable. So if you make your happiness dependent on the world outside and the things out there, you're going to be unhappy, you're going to experience suffering. But also, if you think that you've got some kind of special, unchanging, essential quality, and you're the centre of the universe, and you're very, very special, well, that's going to cause you suffering as well. That's going to cause you and other people suffering. So this is this really important teaching of dukkha. Yeah. So, there's nothing fixed. There's nothing fixed and independent in anything. You can't find anything fixed or anything independent in anything anywhere in the world. It's all shunyata, it's all empty. And not only that, all these ideas and all these concepts that people come up with, they're just play words, they're just labels. People come up with labels and play words, and we just arbitrarily divide the reality up into little bits, and we give them names, and we think there's some kind of essential quality there's something fixed about them. But they're just play words, they're just like castles in the sky. There's nothing real about them, they're just fantasy ideas. Yeah, and then to top it all off, we even experience craving for these fantasy ideas. We give these things labels like cars. I've heard in the 21st century we have these things called cars. And people experience, it's an imaginary idea, and people experience craving for it. They want a car. And then they have this idea of themselves being kind of fixed and separate, and they experience anxiety for things like success, these fantasy things, kind of reputation, success. It's all just a load of nonsense, it doesn't exist. So we create ourselves, or you create yourself suffering. I don't, because I'm the great Nagarjuna. So what is this? What is the use of this? What is the use of shunyata? What's the use of my teachings? Well, the practical use of my teaching is don't take yourself so seriously. Don't you take yourself so seriously. And don't take your ideas, your concepts so seriously, because they're just arbitrary. They're just labels that we've used to divide the world up. It could be anything. We could make up any words and any labels. They're just arbitrary. Don't take them so seriously. Don't take yourself so seriously. And if you want to be happy, what you should do is make your practice about other people. The Bodhisattva practice of the Mahayana. You should be practicing about other people. You should practice generosity, compassion. That's the practical application. Don't take yourself so seriously. Yeah, because your ideas and your concepts, they're just fancy play words. They're just make-believe. And even this concept of self is make-believe. This concept of you is make-believe. It's all fantasy. And it's just play words. You don't really exist. So don't take yourself so seriously. Now, that's enough from me. I'd like to introduce you to my friend, Asanga. He gets his teachings from smelly dogs. So let's see what the smelly dogs have got to say.
Let me introduce myself. My name is Asanga. Now,
Dr. Doolittle.
I have to admit that my esteemed friend Nagarjuna is a clever chap. And I have to admit that when he says we practice for the Bodhisattva idea, we practice for others, he's got something. But I ask you, does all this clever stuff he's talking about, does it really help our practice? He has told you, you don't really exist. So presumably other people don't really exist either. He's told you that all the ideas we've had, including the ideas of the Dharma, are just empty concepts, just made up of play words. They don't tell us anything about reality. So he says, don't take yourself seriously, and don't take your ideas seriously. Which means don't take the Dharma seriously.
Yeah, he did say that.
Take some support. Now, I can see where he's coming from, but if we base our practice on these ideas, if we take these ideas literally, we are going to get into a very big mess. Firstly, we need to take ourselves seriously. We need to take ourselves very, very seriously. Our minds exist. And we need to be very serious and very careful about the things we do and say and think that affect our minds, that affect the current of our minds. We need to be very careful about how we live and the karma we create. We need to take ourselves and our karma seriously. We need to take very seriously the fact that we are creating the person we're going to become in the future, and that matters. That's seriously. If we think, hey, I don't really exist. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, does it? It doesn't matter how I create the person I will be in the future by my actions. So I won't really practice. I won't get anywhere. But if we do that, we could end up in states of great suffering. If we don't take karma seriously and ourselves seriously, we could end up in states of great suffering. And try telling someone who is in a state of great suffering that their suffering doesn't exist.
Oh, my turn again.
And secondly, well, I mean, it comes out of that we need to take other people very seriously. If we don't take ourselves seriously, how can we take others seriously? If we don't exist, others don't exist. Mr. Nagarjuna tells us, but they really exist too. Their suffering is very, very real to them. Their happiness. Their happiness is very real to them. If we want to make progress on the path, if we want to be less shut up in obsession with ourselves, we have to really take others seriously. We have to really care about them. We have to think they're real. Or how are we going to care about them? How can we do that if we think they don't really exist? So that's two things. Take ourselves seriously, take others seriously. And thirdly, we need to take ideas very seriously. Mr. Nagarjuna has just told us that ideas are just so many play words. They don't really matter. They don't really exist. Like it or not, our ideas about the way the world is shape the way we behave. Some ideas will lead us down dead ends and slippery slopes to very nasty places we don't want to go. Some ideas, like the ideas that Dharma gives us, lead us to places where we grow, where our minds become clearer, where our hearts become warmer, where our whole existence becomes brighter. Hooray! So we need to take ideas seriously, Mr. Nagarjuna, very, very seriously. And particularly, we need to take the ideas of the Dharma seriously. Telling that all ideas are just empty, so many play words, if we took that seriously, we wouldn't have a practice. If ideas have no meaning, that means that ideas like living with compassion, striving to help the world, living in an upright, noble way, living in a responsible way that helps others and doesn't harm the world around us, they're all just empty, meaningless words. All those ideas, all the higher values that we can live by, they're all just meaningless words. We become nihilistic. It's on the flip chart somewhere. We become nihilistic. We might as well all go out and eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die. We might as well get as much for ourselves as we can and hell with the rest of you. Because all our higher ideals are just meaningless words. So much fun. When I came on the scene, something was needed to balance this dangerous, destructive stuff that Mr. Nagarjuna had been putting out.
Referee!
And very humbly, I think I did just that. Or I played my part in doing that, as we'll see. It wasn't really me that did it, but I had a lot of help. So let me tell you a bit about myself. If I say it myself, I'm a great meditator. And eventually, after long, devoted years of meditation, something very special happened to me. Now, what the people of my era would say about what happened, what we said about what happened, was that during my meditation, I often visited a higher realm called the Tushita heaven. And while in the Tushita heaven, in meditation, I received teachings from Maitreya, the future Buddha, who was practicing in that realm, waiting to come back to the earth in the future eon.
He's just a show-off.
Now, okay, to people of your era, that might sound like a load of old hogwash. But according to the Buddhist tradition, we can actually access higher levels of reality in meditation. People of your era would probably say that the Tushita heaven is an imaginative way of describing just such a higher level of reality. In my day, the future Buddha, that's a tongue twister, Maitreya, was said to dwell in this higher level of meditation, teaching the Dharma to gods and to anyone else who could raise their mind to that level. You would probably say that in my meditation I contacted a source of deep wisdom and clear vision that was not available to me in my normal state of mind, and that this deeper wisdom was the source from which my writings and my teachings flowed. Anyway, I'll leave you to decide. I'll leave you to decide whether your modern way of describing things is better or whether the way we describe things is better. I have to say, to me, your way sounds just a teensy bit boring. Anyway, however you describe it, it wasn't me that wrote the Yogacara text. The wisdom for that came from beyond my normal personality. And these writings and teachings breathed new life into Buddhism and had a huge impact on countless people and several cultures down the ages. So that even in my own time, I was quite famous, actually. So the Chinese traveller, Tuan San, even he had heard about me, and he wrote, in a great mango grove 5 or 6 leagues to the southwest of the city of Ayodhya, there is an old monastery where Asanga Bodhisattva received teachings and guided the common people. At night he went up to the realm of Maitreya Bodhisattva in the Tushita heaven to learn the Yogacara. In the daytime he lectured on the marvellous principles he discovered to a great audience. And of course, over time, all sorts of stories grew up about me. It was all such a long time ago that I actually find it quite difficult to remember which of the stories is true. But according to one of the stories, I spent 12 years meditating in a cave high in the mountains, seeking to break through to that higher, deeper level of reality, seeking to contact Maitreya. But absolutely nothing happened. For 12 years, I got nowhere. So several times I gave up and started on the long, disheartened trek back home. But each time, as soon as I got to civilization, something happened that gave me new hope. Something happened that gave me new hope, and I went back to my cave. Each time. But 12 long years. But then after 12 long years, I felt that I had really finally had enough. Obviously, I'd been fooling myself. I was banging my head against a brick wall. It was all a delusion. So I left the cave and started walking back to the lowlands. And then, according to this story, which I can't remember whether it's true or not, on the outskirts of the first town I came to, just as I was about to re-enter civilization, I saw an old she-dog. In a terrible state. In a terrible state. She'd been badly injured. And her wounds were crawling with maggots.
Ew.
And coming after this long spell of meditation, I mean, I was just completely overcome with compassion for this poor dog. This poor dog. I was desperate to do something. She needed to get rid of those maggots. But at the same time, I couldn't bear to harm the maggots either. So, the story says, I can't remember this, surely I would have remembered this. Anyway, the story says that I knelt down and prepared to transfer the maggots off the dog with my tongue. So what I saw in front of me was so disgusting. I closed my eyes, and I put my tongue out, experimentally feeling for a maggot. And then suddenly I heard this great ringing in my ears, so I opened my eyes, and there before me, blazing with golden light, was the Bodhisattva Maitreya. Hooray! To be honest, I was a bit peeved. I said to Maitreya, hey, I've just spent 12 years meditating on you, in a cave in the mountains, but not a glimmer of yourself did you show. And then, why didn't you appear to me then? Why do you appear to me now when I'm not in a higher state of meditation? I'm actually feeling rather cheesed off. Doing something rather ugly and disgusting. And Maitreya answered, I was with you all the time, actually. I was there all the time, but you couldn't see me because you did not have the great compassion. I've got a terrible memory. I can't remember whether it's true, strictly true. It might be that it's meant to make a point. I don't know. It might be that it's meant to make a point that if you want to contact Maitreya, enlightenment, if you want to contact a more enlightened mind, you have to have metta. You have to have Maitreya's name means loving one, Maitreya. It comes from the Sanskrit Maitri, which is metta. In Pali, we call it metta. If you don't have metta, forget it. Forget it. All the meditation in the world's not going to do you any good if you don't have metta. And that's a strong, it's a good teaching for you lot actually, because I've noticed in my sort of looking down upon the world from my higher state that in the West, there's quite, in your time, there's quite a lot of Buddhists who think they can get enlightened, get deep insight without metta. Forget it. You need metta, okay. So there's a teaching for you. Anyway, it's also said that I carried this dog. I can't remember what happened when I carried this dog around. Nobody could see it. No, there was something happened. I carried the dog through the village, didn't I? Anyone else remember the story?
I think so, but no one could see it.
And nobody could see it. Nobody could see the dog, except an old lady who saw my trail. Is that right? Or did she see the dog and say, why are you carrying out the dog?
Sure, story.
Anyway, I got a dog. So what about all these famous Yogacara teachings that had such an effect on Buddhism? There was a lot to it, okay? There were teachings about all the different levels of mind. There were teachings about the different ways that something could be true. There were really detailed teachings about the states of mind that we can experience, all the sort of stuff that Mr. Nagarjuna was just thrown out as meaningless. But I can't really sum all that up in 5 minutes, but there was one really, really big idea. Big idea. A big idea that gives us something to balance the three teachings of my friend Nagarjuna, and that is the idea of mind only. So in some countries, the Yogacara is called Chitta Matra. Chitta means heart or mind, and Matra means only. So this is teaching of mind only. What is real is mind. Mind is real. Mind is what is real. Nagarjuna says nothing is real, but mind is real. Now this is a very difficult concept to explain in 5 minutes to a group of people who've been raised in a materialist society. I concede that. But I'll boil it down. What I would advise you is to see the world less like a dead machine in which that stuff out there is sort of... Oops.
Oh, that's all right.
See the world as less like a dead machine with stuff out there which is real, and see the world more like a dream. See the world as more like a dream. You might have heard Daniel talking about this last week. See all phenomena as dreamlike. So, in a dream, we see the things out there. We see things out there, but what's out there isn't what is really real. What is most real is the mind that is doing the dreaming. Change the mind, dream changes. If the mind is anxious, frustrated, troubled, the dream will be anxious, frustrated and troubled. If the mind is free and inspired, the dream could be wonderful, full of light and beauty. In the right situations, deep meanings will come through in the dream. Deep meanings will break through the surface. And these deep meanings are far more real than all the trivial stuff, the monsters we run away from, and all the other stuff that happens in a dream. That's real. And life is like that. We'd be far better off to treat this world as like that. That's what the mind-only teaching is saying. So, one of the big ideas of the Yogacara is the most useful way to see things is to see the world we live in that way, to see it a bit like a dream. And it's not that we're each dreaming our own individual little dreams, so that you lot are just figments of my imagination. We're not saying that. It's more like together we are dreaming this world. That's difficult, isn't it? We are creating this world together. We're dreaming the world together. And we do this because there's a deep level of mind that we share. So I saw a diagram once where our minds seems a bit like this, okay? So this is you, and this is me. And we've got a level of mind which is completely distinct. We've got deeper levels of mind, but at some level, we're not distinct. At some level, there's a level of mind which is there for all of us. It's as though there's a deep river that we are sort of rivulets of. And what we do affects the deeper river, and the deeper river affects us. Our thoughts and our actions are like substances we pour into this river. We can poison it, we can make it muddy, or we can beautify it. And so, because the mind is real, the Yogacara tradition also tells us that visionary meditation experiences we have, like the ones I had from Maitreya, they're real. They're real. They're, in a sense, more real than the surface material world. Okay? If we've been brought up in a nihilistic, materialistic society, we might think that it's just stuff that's real, just stuff that's out there. And meditation experiences, well, they're just something that happens in the mind. They don't matter. But the Yogacara tells us the mind is what is real. The mind is more fundamental and real than the surface world of matter. There's deep meaning behind this world. To the materialist who thinks there is just matter, my old sandals and my old cooking pot when I was meditating in my cave for 12 years, those are more real than my visions of Maitreya. My visions of Maitreya transformed whole cultures. So who cares about my sandals?
It's my turn again now. Yeah, that big show off talking about his meditation experience. I think he spent too much time around smelly dogs. It went to his head, I think. Anyway. Yeah, so I think Mr. Asanga misrepresented me. It wasn't that I don't teach that we don't exist at all. It's not that there's no self at all. What I teach is that there's no fixed self, there's no unchanging self, there's no separate, independent self. That's what I teach. I don't teach there's no self at all. So I think he was twisting my words and making it sound different. That Mr. Asanga. Don't know where he's gone, but he's twisting my words. So in fact, what I taught was, it's better to have a sense of self, sense of yourself, as big as this Buddhist Centre, or even as big as the Sheffield Arena, than to have the wrong idea about no self. If you think that there's no self, you've got the wrong idea. And I say it's like picking up a snake from the wrong end. If you take shunyata the wrong way, you'll get bitten, and it'll hurt you. So you have to be very, very important with this. You have to be very careful with this teaching of shunyata. And that's why the Nagas needed to protect it from lesser minds, like that Asanga, who wouldn't understand it. It's only for the, when the minds are ready for it, that's when the Nagas can give you this teaching on shunyata. Yes. So just to look at the name of my school. Majjhimaka means middle way. So the Majjhimaka school means the middling school, the middle school. And it's a middle between two wrong views, two extreme views. And there's an extreme view, which is a lot of other religions fall into this trap of eternalism. They think there's an eternal soul, that you're going to live forever. that there's an eternal being like a god, some kind of god. That's eternalism, and that's wrong. That's a wrong view. So we need to apply shunyata to that. It's empty. It's nonsense. And then there's a whole lot of other people who are nihilists. They think that there's nothing of value. Everything's just a big dead machine. Or even worse than that, that we don't exist at all, that there's no self at all. They're nihilists. So my school, the Majjhimaka school, is a middling school, the middle way. And so it's not that there's nothing at all. Shunyata doesn't mean, emptiness is a bit misleading. You could also say shunyata means fullness. Because if you in between, the space in between the eternalists and the nihilists is a mysterious and wonderful reality. A really wonderful reality. It's full of wonder, full of magic, full of mystery. And that's really what the absolute truth, that's what the real truth is. That's what the real truth is. But I'll accept Mr. Asanga isn't completely wrong, actually. He's not completely wrong. And I think we do share some common ground. So let's explore this common ground. So yeah, we do need, the real truth, the absolute truth of things is a mystery. It's beyond concepts. It's beyond words. And it can only be seen directly by the wise. But we need language to talk about it. We need words to talk about it. We need concepts to talk about it. So yeah, Mr. Asanga's concept, it's not a bad one actually. This mind-only concept, it's okay. It's a good concept. And it's like, I say there's two levels of truth. There's the absolute level of truth, where everything is empty, everything's shunyata. But also there's a conventional level of truth. We need languages, we need words to talk about things, to describe things. We need words to go beyond words. So there's a conventional level of truth. And my sutras, my Perfection of Wisdom sutras, use both of these levels of truth. They would play between absolute truth and conventional truth and try and confuse the mind of the reader with these baffling paradoxes. So they say things like the Bodhisattva must save all beings, at the same time seeing that there's no beings to be saved. So there's a play between relative conventional truth and absolute truth. And these sutras will just baffle the mind with paradoxes. So yeah, so we need languages and concepts, we need ideas, and Mr. Asanga's idea is a good idea. We need conventional truth. It's like we need maps. So if we're trying to make sense of our experience, we're trying to navigate our experience, we need a good map that's going to tell us where to go. So if you're going, for example, you're going around London, you'll need a map of the London Underground to help you to show your way around, to get from the Tower of London to Big Ben. But it'd be a real shame if once you got there you had your head stuck in the map and you didn't see the wonderful mystery and reality and all the sounds and the smells and the sights of London, and you had your head stuck in the map all the time. And that's what happens if we take our concepts literally as being true, like the Abhidharmis of my time, or some of Mr. Asanga's followers. Some of Mr. Asanga's followers think there's this kind of one big shared mind, which sounds a bit eternalistic to me. It sounds like some kind of God idea or something like that. So if you take your ideas literally, you'll get into a pickle. But we need ideas. We need a good map to navigate around our experience. And yeah, I'll give Mr. Asanga that. His ideas, they weren't too bad. They're a reasonable map.
Okay, well, I'm out of character now, but enough of the patronising me. I'm out. So, okay, what do we make of this? What do we make of this? We presented these, rather falsely, we presented these as two sort of conflicting philosophies, if you like. I'm not sure it was ever like that, actually. That's how Western scholars tend to view differences like this. But actually, I think these, I think the Yogacara and the Majjhimaka have actually existed in a sort of creative tension within Buddhism, which has actually enriched it immensely. So our teacher Sangha he's been very clear. He says we need both. We need both. We need both. One of the things he said is, at the philosophical level, we should be Majjhimaka, and at the level of practice, we should be Yogacara. So we do take our mind seriously, we take ourselves seriously, we take our other people seriously, and we take the Dharma seriously, and we take meditation experiences seriously and see them as real. But at the same time, we don't take anything literalistically. So one of the great things about the Dharma, if we're talking spiritual truths, we're always talking in stories and metaphors. And one of the great things about Buddhism is that as compared to other religions, is it doesn't take its stories and metaphors literally. God is a story or a metaphor, for example. It could be quite useful. It can be really useful to think of there's this compassionate force in the universe. It could also lead you to fly aeroplanes into skyscrapers, if you take it literally. So there's a protection by really living the myth, but not quite taking the myth literally. And I think, as far as I know, the Dharma is the only spiritual tradition that sort of sees its own stories as stories. And I think that's really important. So on the one hand, the Yogacara approach is you really live the story. The Majjhimaka approach is you've got that idea that, well, we're only ever talking about as-ifs. We're only ever saying reality is, it's a bit as if so-and-so. It's a bit as if there is one mind. It's a bit as if mind is the only thing there is. So Sangha actually says, if one takes the expression one mind too literally, then one needs the concept of shunyata to dissolve that literalness. If you start taking shunyata literally, there is no hope for you at all. So better to be a little bit more towards the eternalistic side, maybe? Perhaps under certain circumstances, he says that the concept of shunyata is an antidote to an over-literal understanding of one mind. But under certain circumstances, the concept of one mind is an antidote for an over-literal understanding of shunyata. So we need to have this middle way. And in history, Prabhupada was right. Nagarjuna wasn't a nihilist, but some of his followers have been. And particularly some of his followers today are. We've just wiped out all concepts, nothing really exists, I just do away with myself, there's no values. On the other hand, if we take the idea of the one mind that we all tap into literally, it could sound a bit like God. And this taking the mind literally could sound a bit like the eternal soul. We could be sort of veering off, especially in some of the later Yogacara, where they talk about the spotless essence of mind. We could be sort of veering off towards eternalism. We have to find that middle way. So I think we need a bit of both, and it may depend on where we are, which one we need most. If we're a bit intellectually minded, we may make the mistake of thinking that, sinking into scepticism about anything that goes beyond the intellect, deconstructing all the higher values, being too clever for our own good, not responding with faith to the Dharma, or being receptive to anything that seems to come from a higher level of reality. And if we're a bit that way inclined, then we need to see, if we think that matter is all that's real and that stuff goes on in meditation, it's just in the mind, well, then we maybe need to experiment with taking the world of the archetypal and the imaginal much more seriously. We could experiment with thinking more in terms of the world being a mind or the world being a dream, not a machine. If we live in a world that's a machine, that is going to be really, really boring. It's going to be really, really deadening. Life will seem meaningless, dead and grey, and we won't take the spiritual life very seriously if we think the world's a machine and we're a machine. We've got to get out of that. On the other hand, if we tend to be wide open to any idea that comes along, hey, it's all about the justified elders of Mu or whatever, then maybe we need a bit more rational mind. Maybe we need a bit of the cutting edge of Nagarjuna's take on things. I personally have a sense that most of us, living as we do in a very materialist society, I mean a philosophically materialist society, where we think that matter's what's real, we're indoctrinated to see the surface world of matter as what is real, and that the mind is less important. The mind's just created by matter. I think we could do well to experiment with a bit more Yogacara style thinking. Let go a bit of the critical faculty. Try out some new ways of thinking that free us up. See the world as a more magical place where there's deep meanings under that surface. More like a dream than a machine. A place where our mental states really matter, really have an effect. Can do magic. A place where our mental states can do magic, for good or ill. A place where Nagas really do live in the depths and where you really can contact higher beings in meditation. I think that most of us probably need to take that a bit more on, actually. And the great thing about taking that on is that it allows us to live in a much more vibrantly alive world. We tend to live in a rather dead world. We've deadened the world around us. Sangha says, I would go so far as to say that a universe conceived of is dead is not a universe in which one stands any chance of gaining enlightenment. We need to bring the universe alive. And one way to do that, we've just got to get out of this metaphor of it being a machine. The machine analogy sort of works for some things, but it ain't going to work in the spiritual sphere. So the Yogacara has got a lot to teach us. But also the Majjhimaka's got a lot to teach us. We do need to take on board that our ideas around things like success, the values we place on things, are, we invent them. They are stories. Anyway, so I think we need a bit of both. And we really need to sort of go a bit with that mythic element that the Yogacara brings, but also have that intellectual clarity.